the sins of a father are often passed down to their sons. And so it is the case with the sins of mothers as well. The enmity between Queen Alicent and Princess Rhaenyra was passed on to their sons, and the Queen's 3 boys, Prince Aegon, Aemon and Daemon, grew to be bitter rivals of their Velaryon nephews, resentful for them for having stolen for what they regarded as their birthright. Though all 6 boys attended the same feasts, and sometimes trained together in the yard under the same master at arms, and studied under the same maesters, this enforced closeness only served to feed their mutual dislike for each other, rather than binding them together as brothers. Whilst Princess Rhaenyra misliked her stepmother, Queen Alicent, she became fond and more than fond of her sister-in-law, Lady Laena. With Driftmark and Dragonstone so close, Daemon and Laena often visited with the princess, and her with them. Many a time they flew together on their dragons. In 118 AC, with the blessing of King Viserys, Rhaenyra announced the betrothal of her 2 eldest sons to the daughters of Prince Daemon and Lady Laena, Jacaerys 4 and Lucerys 3, the twin girls 2. And in 119 AC, when Laena found out she was with child again, Rhaenyra flew to Driftmark to attend her during the birth. And so it was that the princess was at her side on the 3rd day of that cursed year 120 AC, the year of the Red Spring. A day and a night of labour left Laena Velaryon pale and weak. Finally, she gave birth to the son Prince Daemon had so longed for, but the baby was twisted and malformed, dying within an hour. Nor did his mother long survive him. Her grueling labour had drained Lady Laena's strength, and grief weakened her further still, making her helpless before the onset of childbed fever. As her condition steadily worsened, despite the best efforts of Driftmark's young maester, Prince Daemon flew to Dragonstone and brought back Princess Rhaenyra's own maester, an older and more experienced man, renowned for his skills as a healer. Sadly, Maester Geraldus came too late. After 3 days of delirium, Lady Laena passed from the mortal coil. She was 27 years old. During her final hour, it is said that Lady Laena rose from her bed, pushed away the sceptres praying over her, and made her way from her room, intent on reaching Vhagar, that she might fly one last time. Her strength failed her on the tower steps though, and it was there she collapsed and died. Her husband, Prince Daemon, carried her back to her bed. Afterward, Mushroom tells us that Princess Rhaenyra sat vigil with Daemon over Laena's corpse, and comforted him in his grief. Lady Laena's death was the first tragedy of 120 AC, but it would not be the last, for this was to be the year when many of the long-simmering tensions and jealousies that plagued the 7 kingdoms finally came to a boil. A year when many and more would have reason to wail and grieve, though none more so than the sea snake, Lord Corlys Velaryon, and his noble wife, Princess Rhaenys, the woman who could have been a queen. The Lord of the Tides and his lady were still in mourning for their beloved daughter when the stranger came once again to carry off their son. Sir Lenor Velaryon, husband to Princess Rhaenyra and the apparent father of her children, was slain whilst attending a fair in Spicetown, stabbed to death by his friend and companion, Sir Carl Corey. The 2 men had been quarrelling loudly before blades were drawn. Merchants at the fair told Lord Velaryon when he came to collect his son's body. Corey had fled by them, wounding several men who tried to hinder him. Some claimed a ship had been waiting offshore, but he was never seen again. The circumstances of the murder remain a mystery to this day. Grand Maester Melos writes only that Sir Lenor was killed by one of his own household knights after a quarrel. Septon Eustace provides us with the killer's name and declares jealousy the motive for the slaying. Lenor Velaryon had grown weary of Sir Carl's company and had grown enamoured with a new favourite, a handsome young squire of 16. Mushroom, as always, favours the most sinister theory, suggesting that Prince Daemon paid Carl Quarry to dispose of Princess Rhaenyra's husband, arranged a ship to carry him away, then cut his throat and fed him to the sea. A household knight of relatively low birth, Quarry was known to have a lord's taste and a peasant's purse, and was given to extravagant wagering, which leads a certain credence to this version of events. Yet there was no shred of proof, then or now, that the sea snake offered a reward of 10,000 golden dragons for any man who could lead him to Sir Carl Quarry, or deliver the killer. Even this was not the end of the tragedies that would mark that dreadful year. The next occurred at high tide after Sir Lenor's funeral, when the king and court made their journey to Driftmark to bear witness at his pyre, many on the backs of their dragons. So many dragons were present that Septon Eustace wrote that Driftmark had become the new Valyria. The cruelty of children is known to all. Prince Aegon Targaryen was 13, Princess Helena 11, Prince Aemon 10, and Prince Daemon 6. Both Aegon and Helena were dragon riders. Helena now flew Dreamfire, whilst her brother Aegon, the young Sunfire, who is said to be the most beautiful dragon seen upon the earth. Even the young Prince Daemon had a dragon, a young blue dragon named Tessarion, though he had yet to ride it. Only the middle son, Prince Aemon, remained dragonless, but Aemon had hopes of rectifying that, and had put forward the notion that perhaps might stop by a dragonstone after the funeral. A wealth of dragon eggs could be found beneath the dragon mount, and several young hatchlings as well. The prince could have his choice of dragon, but even at 10, Aemon Targaryen did not lack for boldness. He resolved not to wait for dragonstone. What did he want with some puny hatchling or some stupid egg? Right there at high tide was a dragon worthy of him, Vhagar, the oldest, largest, most terrible dragon in the world after the death of the Black Dread. Even for a son of House Targaryen, there are always dangers in approaching a dragon, particularly an old, bad-tempered dragon who had recently lost her rider. His father and mother would never allow him to go near Vhagar. Aemon knew, much less try and ride her, so he made certain they did not know, sliding from his bed at dawn whilst they still slept, and stealing down to the outer yard where Vhagar and the other dragons were fed and stabled. The prince had hoped to mount Vhagar in secrecy, but as he crept up to the dragon, a boy's voice rang out. "You stay away from her." The voice belonged to the youngest of his half-nephews, Joffrey Velaryon, a boy of 3, and an early riser. Joffrey had sneaked down from his bed to see his own dragon, Tyrax. Afraid that the boy would raise the alarm, Prince Aemon shouted at him to be quiet, then shoved him backwards into a pile of dragon droppings. As Joffrey began to bawl, Aemon raced back to Vhagar and clambered up upon her back. Later he would say that he was so afraid of being caught that he forgot to be frightened. Call it boldness, call it madness, call it fortune, or the will of the gods. Who can know the mind of a dragon? But we do know this. Vhagar roared, lurched to her feet, shook violently, then snapped her chains and flew, and the boy prince Aemon Targaryen became a dragon rider, circling twice around the towers of high tide before coming down again. But when he landed, Rhaenyra's sons were waiting for him. Joffrey had run to get his brothers when Aemon took to the sky, and both Jace and Luke had come. The Velaryon princelings were younger than Aemon. Jace was 6, Luke 5, and Joffrey only 3, but there was still 3 of them, and they'd armed themselves with wooden swords from the trading yard. They fell on Aemon with a fury. The prince fought back, breaking Luke's nose with a punch, then wrenching a sword from Joffrey's hand and cracking it across the back of Jace's head, driving him to his knees. As the younger boy scrambled back away from him, bloody and bruised, the prince began to mock them, laughing and calling them the Strongs. Jace, at least, was old enough to grasp the insult. He flew at Aemon once again, but the older boy began pummeling him savagely, until Luke, coming to the rescue of his brother, drew his dagger and slashed Aemon across the face, taking out his right eye. By the time the stable boys finally arrived to pull apart the combatants, the prince was withering on the ground, howling in pain, and Vhagar was roaring as well.